The Flower Ornament Scripture, a translation of the Avatamsaka Sutra by Thomas Cleary, read by Angus Cargill. Book 2, The Appearance of the Buddha. At that time, the enlightening beings and the leaders of all the worlds formed these thoughts. What are the stages of the Buddha? What are the vistas of the Buddha? What are the empowerments of the Buddha? What are the acts of the Buddha? What are the powers of the Buddha? What are the fearlessnesses of the Buddha? What are the meditations of the Buddha? What are the invincibilities of the Buddha? What are the sense organs of the Buddha? What are the minds of the Buddha? What are the lights of the Buddha? What are the lights of the Buddha's body? What are the halos of the Buddha? What are the voices of the Buddha? What are the knowledges of the Buddha? O please, world-honored one, pity us and explain to us. Also, all the Buddhas of all oceans of worlds in the 10 directions explain to the enlightening beings the oceans of worlds, the oceans of sentient beings, the oceans of Buddha's liberations, the oceans of Buddha's mystical displays, the oceans of Buddha's teachings, the oceans of Buddha's names, the oceans of Buddha's lifespans, as well as the oceans of vows of all enlightening beings, the oceans of approaches of all enlightening beings, the oceans of aids to the way of all enlightening beings, the oceans of all vehicles of enlightening beings, the oceans of activities of all enlightening beings, the oceans of emancipations of all enlightening beings, the oceans of psychic powers of all enlightening beings, the oceans of ways of transcendence of all enlightening beings, the oceans of stages of enlightening beings, and the oceans of knowledge of all enlightening beings. Please, O Buddha, enlightened one, world-honored one, explain these for us too. Then the enlightening beings, by mystical power, produced sound issuing spontaneously from the clouds of offerings, speaking verses. Countless eons of practice complete, you've become truly awake under the enlightenment tree. You appear universally to liberate beings, like clouds filling all to the end of time. When beings have doubts, you put an end to them, causing all to develop great faith and resolution. Everywhere removing unlimited suffering, you make all experience the peace of the Buddhas. An infinite number of enlightening beings have all come here to behold you. Please explain the truth, eliminate doubt, according to our capacities to receive. How can we know the stages of the Buddhas? How can we observe the Buddha's sphere? The empowerment of the Buddha has no bounds. Please show us this truth and purify us. What is the Buddha's realm of action that can be entered by wisdom? Buddha's power is pure and unlimited. Please show it to us, enlightening beings. What are your vast meditation states? How do you purify fearlessness? Your mystic powers cannot be measured. Please explain in accord with beings' dispositions. The Buddhas, kings of truth, are like the world leaders. Free wherever they go, none can constrain them. This and other great teachings, please expound for the benefit of all. How are the Buddha's eyes innumerable, as also are the other organs of sense? And how are the minds also countless? Please show us a way to know about this. As are the oceans of worlds and oceans of beings, all oceans of arrangements in the cosmos, so are the oceans of Buddhas, unbounded. Please tell all to the children of Buddha. The ocean of transcendent ways, forever beyond conception, the ocean of techniques for universal liberation, the ocean of all the aspects of the teaching. Please expound at this enlightenment site. At that point, the Buddha, knowing what the enlightening beings were thinking, emitted a multitude of light rays from his teeth. Those light rays were as numerous as atoms in a Buddha field. They included, for example, light rays of flowers of jewels illumining everywhere, light rays producing various sounds adorning the universe, light rays draping subtle clouds, light rays showing the Buddhas of the 10 directions sitting on their sites of enlightenment, making mystical displays, light rays of umbrellas of clouds of flames of all jewels, light rays filling the universe without impediment, light rays adorning all Buddha fields, light rays setting up banners of pure diamonds, light rays adorning the scenes of enlightenment where hosts of enlightening beings were assembled, light rays with subtle vibrations, intoning the names and epithets of all the Buddhas. There were as many such light rays as there are atoms in a Buddha field, and each individual ray had as many light beams accompanying it. Those lights all contained all exquisite jewel-like hues, and they each illumined oceans of worlds as numerous as atoms in a billion Buddha lands. The congregations of enlightening beings in all the other oceans of worlds could see this lotus bank array ocean of worlds within those lights. By the spiritual power of the Buddha, those lights, in the presence of all those enlightening beings, intoned these verses. Cultivating oceans of practices over countless eons, making offerings to oceans of Buddhas everywhere, teaching and liberating the oceans of all beings, now fulfilling sublime enlightenment, the universal illuminator. From his pores come magic clouds with light shining through all quarters, awakening those able to receive the teaching, causing them to approach enlightenment, pure, unhindered. Buddha traversed all paths of existence, teaching and developing the living beings. The mystic powers at his command are infinite. Instantly, he causes all to be freed. The enlightenment tree of precious gems is embellished with the finest adornments. Buddha truly awakes under it, emanating light, majestically shining. The roar of his great voice fills all quarters, preaching for all the way to great peace. According to the mental dispositions of beings, he wakes them by various means. He practiced transcendent ways and fulfilled them, as many as atoms in 1,000 lands. All the powers he has already attained. You should all go and pay him respect. Buddha children of all quarters, as many as atoms of lands, all come together with joy, having showered clouds of offerings. Now they stand before Buddha with single-minded gaze. One tone of the Buddha contains an infinity, able to expound the deep ocean of scriptures, reigning the sublime teaching in accord with all minds, that most honored human you should all go see. The vows of Buddhas of all times are told under the enlightenment tree. All appear in an instant. Hurry to the Buddha's spot. Vairochana's great ocean of knowledge shines from his face for all to see. Now, awaiting the gathering of the masses, he's about to speak. Go see him and hear what he says. At that time, all the masses in the oceans of worlds in the 10 directions, awakened by the Buddha's light, all went to Vairochana Buddha's place and made offerings. For example, to the east of this flower bank array ocean of worlds, there is an ocean of worlds called a ray of lotuses of pure light. Among its world systems is a land called Diamond Mine of Jewel Necklaces. The Buddha there was called Infinite King Awakening Space, with the Water of Truth. Among that Buddha's vast congregation was a great enlightening being named Lotus Banner Contemplating the Supreme Teaching, who came to the Buddha with a group of enlightening beings as numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds. Each produced 10 kinds of clouds of forms of enlightening beings, filling space and not dissolving. They also manifested 10 kinds of clouds of jewel mountains, 10 kinds of clouds of spheres of sunlight, 10 kinds of clouds of jewel flower ornaments, 10 kinds of clouds of music containing all tones, 10 kinds of clouds of powder incense trees, 10 kinds of clouds of myriad forms of perfume and incense, and 10 kinds of clouds of trees of all kinds of fragrances. Clouds of offerings such as these, as many as atoms in an ocean of worlds, filled all of space, not dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and offered them to him. They then magically produced in the eastern quarter lion seats of banks of lights of various flowers, and sat cross-legged on those seats. South of this flower bank ocean of worlds is an ocean of worlds called Mine of Ornaments of Radiance of Moons Made of All Jewels. Among its world systems is a land called Array of Boundless Light Spheres. The Buddha there was named Polar Mountain King, with the virtues of the light of universal knowledge. Among that Buddha's immense congregation was an enlightening being named Wisdom Universally Illumining the Ocean of Truths, who came to the Buddha along with a group of enlightening beings as numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds. Each produced 10 kinds of clouds of jewels from mines of lights of all adornments, filling space without dispersing. They also manifested 10 kinds of clouds of all-illumining regal jewels, raining all kinds of ornaments, 10 kinds of clouds of blazing jewels intoning the names and epithets of the Buddhas, 10 kinds of clouds of jewels expounding all the Buddha's teachings, 10 kinds of clouds of jewel trees adorning the scene of enlightenment, 10 kinds of jewel clouds of precious light projecting myriad phantom Buddhas, 10 kinds of jewel clouds displaying the forms of the adornments of all sights of enlightenment, 10 kinds of jewel clouds of lamps of intense flames, expounding the realm of the Buddhas, 10 kinds of jewel clouds of forms of the palaces of infinite lands, and 10 kinds of jewel clouds showing images of the Buddhas of past, present, and future. Jewel clouds such as these, as many as atoms in an ocean of worlds, all pervaded space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and offered them to him. Then each produced in the southern quarter lotus bank lion seats of sapphires and rose gold, then sat cross-legged on the seats. To the west of this flower bank ocean of worlds, there is an ocean of worlds named Pleasant Jewel Light. Among the world systems therein is a land called Producing the Best Life Supports. The Buddha there was named Array of Quality Jewels Made of Fragrant Flowers. Among the vast congregation of that Buddha was a great enlightening being called Universal Arrays of Moonlight's Fragrant Flames, who together with as many enlightening beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds, came to the Buddha, each producing 10 kinds of clouds of mansions of all kinds of precious fragrant flowers, filling all space without dispersing. They also produced 10 kinds of clouds of mansions of precious stones of boundless colors and forms, 10 kinds of clouds of mansions of fragrant flames from precious lamps, 10 kinds of clouds of mansions of all pearls, 10 kinds of clouds of mansions of all precious flowers, 10 kinds of clouds of mansions decorated with jewel ornaments, 10 kinds of clouds of mansions manifesting the treasuries of lights of all adornments in the 10 directions, 10 kinds of clouds of mansions of all kinds of embellishments, from throughout the 10 directions. 10 kinds of clouds of mansions studded with all kinds of precious stones, and 10 kinds of clouds of mansions with gates of flowers and networks of chimes. These mansion clouds, as numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, all filled space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then they produced in the western quarter lion seats of great treasuries of gold leaves, and then sat cross-legged on these seats. To the north of this flower bank ocean of worlds, there is an ocean of worlds called treasuries of light spheres of lapis lazuli lotuses. Among the world systems therein is a land called Array of Blue Lotuses. The Buddha's name was King of Sound of the Banner of Universal Knowledge. Among that Buddha's vast congregation was a great enlightening being named Lion Stretch Light, who, with a group of enlightening beings as numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, came to the Buddha, each manifesting 10 kinds of clouds of beautiful trees of all kinds of fragrant jewels, which filled space without dispersing. They also produced 10 kinds of clouds of trees displaying arrays of all trees of infinite colors and forms, 10 kinds of clouds of trees adorned with all flowers, 10 kinds of clouds of trees adorned with spheres of light of the radiance of all jewels, 10 kinds of clouds of trees adorned with physical forms of enlightening beings, perfumed with all kinds of sandalwood, 10 kinds of clouds of trees inconceivably adorned with scenes of past sights of enlightenment, 10 kinds of clouds of trees of sun-like light from treasuries of clothes made of all kinds of jewels, and 10 kinds of clouds of trees emanating all kinds of pleasing sounds. Clouds such as these, numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, extended throughout space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then they each magically produced in the northern quarter lion seats on banks of lotuses with jewel lamps, and sat cross-legged on those seats. Northeast of this flower bank ocean of worlds, there is an ocean of worlds called Rose Gold and Lapis Lazuli Banner. Among the world systems there is a land called Array of Jewels. The Buddha there was called Fearless Lamp of All Truths. Among that Buddha's vast congregation was a great enlightening being called Inexhaustible Mine of Virtues of the Lamp of Supreme Light, who came, with as many enlightening beings as there are atoms in an ocean of worlds, to the Buddha, each producing 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones, of stores of jewel lotuses of boundless forms, which filled space without dispersing. They also produced 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones, of stores of lights of diamonds, 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones, adorned with all kinds of decorations, 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones, of banks of flames, of lamps ringed with jewels, 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones, showering jewel ornaments all over, 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones, of treasuries of precious ornaments, of all fragrant flowers, 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones of mines of regal jewels, showing the adornments of the seats of all Buddhas, 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones of treasuries of jewel branches, and stems of trees of all kinds of precious stones, 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones of all arrays of ornaments, steps, and doors, and 10 kinds of clouds of lion thrones of banks of lights adorned with gems and perfumes. Such clouds as these, as many as atoms in an ocean of worlds, all filled space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them to him as offerings. Then, in the northeast direction, each magically produced a lion seat of jewel lotuses with banners of lights of precious stones, and sat cross-legged thereon. Southeast of this flower bank ocean of worlds is an ocean of worlds called gold-embellished lapis lazuli, light shining everywhere. Among its world systems is a land called pure, fragrant light. The Buddha there was named King of Profound Faith and Universal Joy. Among the Buddha's vast congregation was a great enlightening being called Universal Light of the Lamp of Wisdom, who came to the Buddha along with a group of enlightening beings as numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, each producing 10 kinds of clouds of drapes of all kinds of wish-fulfilling jewels, which filled all of space without dispersing. They also caused to appear 10 kinds of clouds of drapes adorned with all flowers of sapphires, 10 kinds of clouds of drapes of all fragrant jewels, 10 kinds of clouds of drapes of lamps with jewel flames, 10 kinds of clouds of drapes of regal jewels displaying the Buddha's spiritual powers, expounding the teachings, 10 kinds of clouds of drapes of gems in the forms of all clothing adornments, 10 kinds of clouds of drapes of lights of masses of all jewels, 10 kinds of clouds of drapes of sounds of chimes on jewel nets, 10 kinds of clouds of drapes on jewel pedestals with lotus nets, and 10 kinds of clouds of drapes displaying the forms of all inconceivable adornments. Clouds of drapes of jewels such as these, as many as atoms in an ocean of worlds, all filled space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then, to the southeast, each magically produced a lion seat of banks of jewel lotuses and sat cross-legged thereon. Southwest of this flower bank ocean of worlds is an ocean of worlds called Sunlight Shining Everywhere. Among its world systems is a land called Lion Sunlight. The Buddha there was called Sound of Light of Universal Knowledge. Among that Buddha's vast congregation was a great enlightening being named Top Knot of Flames of Radiant Flower Lights, who came to the Buddha with a group of enlightening beings, as many as there are atoms in an ocean of worlds, each manifesting 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of beautiful ornamental jewels, filling space without dispersing. They also produce 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of flowers of arrays of light beams, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of treasures of pearls of boundless colors, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of diamonds emanating the sounds of compassion of all enlightening beings, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of blazing garlands of jewels, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols draped with nets of chimes embellished with precious stones, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols decorated with branches of jewel trees, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of diamonds like the sun shining everywhere, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of all kinds of perfume and incense, 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of stores of sandalwood, and 10 kinds of clouds of parasols of arrays of universal lights of the vast sphere of Buddhahood. Such clouds of parasols of precious substances, numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, all filled space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then, to the southwest, they each magically produced a lion seat of banks of adornments of flames of sapphire light, and sat cross-legged thereon. Northwest of this flower bank ocean of worlds is an ocean of worlds called Precious Light Radiance. Among its world systems is a land called A Ray of Myriad Fragrances. The Buddha there was called Light of the Ocean of Infinite Virtues. Among that Buddha's congregation was a great enlightening being called Jewel King of Inexhaustible Light, who, together with as many enlightening beings as there are atoms in an ocean of worlds, came to the Buddha, each producing 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of radiance of all jewels, filling space without dispersing. They also produced 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of all beautiful flowers, 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of all phantom Buddhas, 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of the Buddha lands of the 10 directions, 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of the jewel trees and thunderous sound of the realm of the Buddhas, 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of all regal gems, 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres instantaneously displaying the forms of infinite beings, 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of the voice of the Buddha's great vow, and 10 kinds of clouds of light spheres of diamonds emanating sounds edifying all sentient beings. Such clouds of light spheres, numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, all filled space without dispersing. Having produced these clouds, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then, to the northwest, they each produced a lion seat of treasuries of awesome qualities of infinite light, and sat cross-legged thereon. Below this flower bank ocean of worlds, there is an ocean of worlds called Treasury of Exquisite Qualities of Lotus Blossom Fragrance. Among its world systems is a land called Radiance of Light of a Jewel Lion. The Buddha there was named Light of the Cosmos. In the vast congregation of that Buddha was a great enlightening being named Wisdom Flaming with the Light of the Universe, who, together with as many enlightening beings as there are atoms in an ocean of worlds, came to the Buddha, each producing 10 kinds of clouds of light beams of mines of all jewels, filling space without dispersing. They also produced 10 kinds of clouds of light beams of all fragrances, 10 kinds of clouds of light beams producing the sounds of all Buddhas explaining the truth, 10 kinds of clouds of light beams revealing the arrays of all Buddha lands, 10 kinds of clouds of light beams of palaces of all beautiful flowers, 10 kinds of clouds of light beams displaying the work of the Buddhas of all ages, teaching sentient beings, 10 kinds of clouds of light beams of flower buds of all inexhaustible treasures, and 10 kinds of clouds of light beams of all kinds of decorated thrones. Clouds of light beams such as these, numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, filled all space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then each created, in the nadir, a lion seat of lotuses with lamps with jewel flames, and sat cross-legged thereon. Above this flower bank ocean of worlds is an ocean of worlds called Radiant Arrays of Precious Stones. Among the world systems there is a land called Formless Subtle Light. The Buddha there was called Unimpeded Light of Virtue. Among that Buddha's vast congregation was a great enlightening being called Vigorous Intellect with Unhindered Power, who, along with as many enlightening beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds, came to the Buddha, each producing 10 kinds of clouds of light flames, of jewels of boundless physical forms, filling space without dispersing. They also produce 10 kinds of clouds of light flames, of webs of precious stones, 10 kinds of clouds of light flames, of jewels bespeaking the practices of infinite enlightening beings, and 10 kinds of clouds of light flames, of lamps of all pearls. Clouds of light flames like these, as numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, all filled space without dispersing. Having caused these clouds to appear, the enlightening beings bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then at the zenith, they each produced a lion seat of lotus banks of light, intoning the voices of the Buddhas, and sat cross-legged thereon. In this way, in as many oceans of worlds as there are atoms in 10 billion Buddha fields, there were as many great enlightening beings, each surrounded by a group of enlightening beings as numerous as atoms in an ocean of worlds, who came to the gathering. These enlightening beings each produce clouds of offerings of various adornments, as numerous as atomic particles in an ocean of worlds, which all filled space without dispersing. And having produced these clouds, they bowed to the Buddha and presented them as offerings. Then, in the direction from which they had come, all magically produced lion seats with various precious adornments, and sat cross-legged on them. After having thus seated themselves, those enlightening beings each produced, from the hair pores of their bodies, light rays of the various colors of all jewels, as many as atoms in 10 oceans of worlds. In each light ray there appeared as many enlightening beings as there are atoms in 10 oceans of worlds, all sitting on lion seats of banks of lotuses. These enlightening beings all could enter into every atom of the oceans of structures in all universes. In each individual atom were vast fields, as many as atoms in 10 Buddha worlds. In each field were all the past, present, and future Buddhas. These enlightening beings were all able to go to all these Buddhas, associate with them, and provide them with offerings, and in each and every thought instant, by means of mastery of dream power, demonstrated teachings enlightening as many sentient beings as there are atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching showing how celestial beings die and are born, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by explaining the teaching of the acts and practices of enlightening beings, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching of the Buddha's virtues and mystical displays which stir all lands, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching of beautifying and purifying all Buddha lands, revealing the ocean of all great vows, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching of the Buddha's voice, which contains the languages of all sentient beings, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching which can shower the rain of all Buddha teachings, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching of light illuminating everywhere in the 10 directions, pervading the cosmos and showing mystical demonstrations, they enlightened as many beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching of all Buddha's power of liberation manifesting the body of Buddha everywhere, filling the cosmos, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds. In every instant, by the teaching of the universally good, enlightening, being setting up the ocean of all sites of enlightenment with all assemblies of beings, they enlightened as many sentient beings as atoms in an ocean of worlds.